Abbey Wick, End User Extension Soil Health Specialist.
I'm Jean Haley. I'm an evaluator, professional evaluator, and that's what I do for a living. I've been doing ag evaluation since the mid 90s.
I'm excited for this week because we talked last week about the evaluation tools and how to select those tools. But then I think we're getting on to the more exciting part that I like, where how these tools that we've selected are actually benefiting and improving our programs and showing impact.
This is really the foundation of all of the evaluation that I do, and I do with all of my clients, and I recommend to everybody to do. And these 5 basic questions are: what do you need to evaluate? Why do you need to evaluate it? Who does it need to serve? When does it need to be done? And what's your budget or resources? All of these things together are going to help you decide what the best tools are to use, because if you only have a week, you're going to be doing something entirely different than if you've only got a year. That who is kind of highlighted in neon there, because I think that that's one of the important things that gets forgotten by many people. Especially in extension, unless this is what you've been hired to do as evaluation, you're being forced to do it, and it's not something that you generally care to do. You've got a bad taste in your mouth about it, maybe. And that's because other people are making you do it. And so everything you're doing is for everybody else. But if you bring that back to being able to collect data for you that's going to serve you, then it's going to be a lot better experience for you and probably for everybody involved. So those are your basics. What do you need to evaluate? Why do you need to evaluate it? That's an important question too. Who is it serving? And not just like, and this is a different, somebody brought this up last week about this is not we're serving the farmers, because that's what we are doing, but who's the evaluation serving? And that's going to be something that we can use. What's the data that we can use to help us improve our programs, or to justify them, or to get more grant money, or whatever it is that we're going to use it for? When do you need to get it done, and what's the budget?
And this needs assessment, I want to mention that when Jean and I did this needs assessment, when she and I first started working together, that took us a couple hours to get through all those questions to really understand what we were trying to do with our evaluation tools. And so be patient with yourself as you go through that process, because it does take a while. And it's good to revisit, as Jean and I were putting this presentation together for today, to revisit all those things too. And, in revisiting things, we're going to take a little trip down memory lane today, which might be a little bit embarrassing for me, but it'll be fun. I kind of want to go into this pre-Jean phase of evaluation and what I was doing. And then we'll go into the post-Jean phase, where you're going to see how everything improves once you start thinking through this needs assessment and you start taking the right steps to do an evaluation. Okay, so Jean, this is one of the conservation tillage evaluations from 2014. This is pre-Jean. Let's take a look at this and see where I made some mistakes. And there are plenty. This might take a while.
I do want to point out, though, first, that this was a really good effort and a good attempt. You knew that you wanted to capture what people knew beforehand and what they knew after, so that we could gather this, knowledge gain. That's definitely, one of those things that we try to hit at all of our programming, and that funders like to see, and that our bosses like to see. How did they gain some knowledge? So I do want to say, applaud that. The next thing, though, that I was trying to figure out when I was looking at this is you've got an 18% increase in knowledge on this first one, but I'm not quite sure how you got there.
And I'm not sure I do either, Jean, because that's when we were looking at this last week. I was like, Jean, you asked me that question, how did you get these numbers? And I didn't even know. So,
yeah,
so
yeah, we want to actually record what we do.
Nothing.
But so these numbers to me were kind of, difficult to truly understand. And then the next thing I noticed, right away was in these numbers is it's a lot easier to actually understand data if you've got them in some kind of order. And you can see that these are not in any kind of order from best to worst or worst to best. And so it makes us look around this chart. We're looking at it, trying to figure out, what does it mean? What are we trying to figure out here? And then when we looked over on the left-hand side, some of our things were strip till and no-till systems.
There's that double barrel.
There you go. So, what if we do, what if I knew about strip till, but I didn't know about no-till? Before I got here, or, these are the kinds of things. So we want to look at those questions to make sure that they're just asking one single question at a time. So really, this was a big data table. And this is, I think, what you were using in your reporting. Is that right?
Yeah, we were using this in our reports, and I'm not sure I ever really was able to pull anything from it. Because there was so much information, like you said, I couldn't see it because it wasn't categorized by that increase in number or increase in knowledge number that I created somewhere out of the blue.
Mm.
but nothing was organized in a way that I could understand it. I think I did one thing right. I think with the categories, those were good. Did not
Yes.
attend the session. So first of all, if you weren't in the session, you did mark down that you didn't attend it.
Mhm.
But then the very little, little, some, much, very much. I think that's better than a 1 through 5 ranking.
Yes. Yes,
So I think we did
absolutely.
some good things there. But yeah, we sure had some double barrel questions in there that made it really difficult to pull information from this table. So
And
okay,
just
let's.
having to look around and when you present a big table like this, you make other people do all the work to figure out what it means. And what we want to do when we're presenting data is make it obvious what it is that we're trying to, what this data is telling us.
I think a lot of us are at this point too. If as we're trained as scientists, we're trained as communicators. We have all these other skill sets that we've developed, but we're not trained to be evaluation specialists. And so,
Right.
so I think a lot of us probably have started at this point. Maybe we're still there, and that's okay. I think first of all, in soil health, I always encourage farmers to admit where they started or admit their failures. And so I'm going to follow that suit and admit some of mine today. And you'll get a few more examples of that in a bit here too. But let's go to the same type of knowledge gain, after meeting Gene with our Conservation Tillage Conference evaluation the following year. And this is a large meeting. This is a, 200, 300 person meeting where we have a bunch of concurrent sessions and breakout sessions. And this is what we did the following year to understand what people were learning in each of those sessions. And already, Gene, I can see where those gains are and how that's changing.
Right. And so this was something that and I love that you've got this highlighted here. The median knowledge score is what we were actually after at this point, because I'm not quite sure what it means when you say that somebody gained an 18% increase in knowledge. I'm not quite sure what that means. But here I can see that somebody went for making sense of microbes. Somebody went from slightly knowledgeable to somewhat knowledgeable. The group as a whole actually went that way. So what we did was we took the median score, and that's not the mean score. Generally speaking, I'm going to use median scores with groups that I think are probably got skewed data, and I'm not going to use that mean score. It can be meaningless, especially on a small scale like this. It doesn't really tell us much information. But if we go with the median score, what was the score where half the people were below it and half the people were above it? Then we kind of know where the group was. We can say that's a more meaningful number. Not sure if I'm explaining that correctly, but I
No,
mean,
that makes a lot of sense. I
I
mean,
don't
maybe
know if that
the
makes sense.
a quick thing, mean, median, mode. Mean is the average. Median is, you said, half below, half above. Mode
Mhm.
is the most frequent number that
Right.
occurred, right?
Yes.
So figuring out what you're going to use, first of all, I mean, I go right to the mean, which is not always the best choice, but in some of the evaluation data, looking at the median is a better choice. So even just that
Yes.
little tip is a good one.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely. And I think that that's something that we generally, I think been taught from little kids. We hear about the average score all the time. What's the average? What's the average? But sometimes the average doesn't make sense. And especially when you've got small scales like this. And when you've got the acreage, for example, you might have you might have a grower that's got 300,000 acres that they're in charge of, and then a whole bunch of growers that have 20 to 30 acres that they're in charge of. So our mean score, our average score is going to be hugely skewed. So if we want to know more about where is the actual middle point, which is what we really think we're doing when we say we're taking the average, what's the middle point? How many people were below this number and how many people, 50% were below it and 50% were above it. So acreage age is another thing where that number can get skewed pretty quickly if you just go for a straight up average. Yeah, and so definitely look at all three of them, but especially when you've got a 5-point scale like this, it's nice to see actual whole steps because we want to see, did somebody go from slightly to very or slightly to somewhat, or no knowledge to slightly, right? So just taking that whole step is what we want to look at. And so what was the median score? And that's why we looked at it that way. There were some other things that were interesting, I felt like, in this data that, immediately when I was looking at it, there was that one point at the bottom, which was, the least good score because it did not budge one bit. But Abby, when you were looking at that data, you knew exactly why that happened.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of my observations then came to play with what we're looking at in this chart. So if we looked at cover crop approaches, soil health implications, we had Shannon and Kurt on that topic, and I know for this meeting that Shannon actually showed up 20 minutes late because she was driving through a blizzard from South Dakota to get to North Dakota, and so that session already, from the start, half of it was already kind of void in a way because both presenters weren't there. So it made it a little chaotic. It made it a little frustrating for the presenters and also for the people attending. So when I see that score of 3, it's like I know Kurt's experience and Shannon's science is outstanding, and so I would have expected that number to increase based on my observations. The other ones I can look at on there are Dave Franzen and Dan Kaiser. They had probably lower knowledge gains because they were in the main ballroom, which was very large. It was set up for 250 people versus the small breakout rooms where everybody else was that were set up for 60 to 70 people. So already they were, having a difficult time to connect in that room. And there's probably a lot of, if we were observing, there's probably a lot of people checking phones or things like that too, because they were just the distance between the presenter and the audience. So, I think still, Jean, we built on this for our next year's evaluation, continuing to improve on what we're looking at and how we're interpreting that information. But this is where using a pairing of both the survey data plus observations within the room during those topics could be really helpful.
Exactly.
But we are going to continue down memory lane for me on practice adoption. And this was, one of the questions we asked for the Conservation Tillage Conference evaluation in our survey, again in 2014, pre-Jean. And so this was, what are farmers or those attending adopting after attending that meeting? And Jean, let's walk through this one because this is a brilliant one.
This one is, it's got some good examples for us. That's for sure.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, and this is something that everybody working in ag extension that one of the focuses is always, well, what are the practices that they're adopting? We're always being asked to measure adoption, and how do we gain that, right? How do we figure that out? So again, I want to applaud that you did that. One of the first things I looked at was there are a couple of categories here that what's the difference between we'll think about it and we'll look into it further. I'm not quite sure, are those categories mutually exclusive or not? I do like I'll try it this year, wondered why I wasn't doing it before, that's kind of a little sploogey, but we could still get something out of that. It's kind of a, that's kind of also implying that I'm going to think about it and look into it in future and that I'm going to try it. So again, these categories are really not mutually exclusive, and you want to make them mutually exclusive. The next thing was, if you look at that second row there, STVT, or reducing the number of tillage passes. So that's strip till, vertical till, or reducing. Is that right? Reducing the number of passes.
Yeah, that's a triple barrel.
Yeah, we want to leave all our Gatling guns at home. And that's yeah, lots of barrels on that baby. And so again, what if they are doing, what if they're going to look at one of them but not all of them? So these are those things that we want to modify, and application method, rate, or timing. Again, you've got a lot of things there. What if I'm going to look at the rate but not the timing or the method? And so if you're just looking at modify an application, you could put in parentheses, including things like, your method, your rate, or your timing. You could do that all in one line. Otherwise, if it reads like this, it's like I'm being asked for 3 things. So the next thing, when we look at this, Abby, can you tell me a little bit about what some of these data are telling you? When we look at trying to figure out what it means.
That's a great question, Jean. I'm not sure that I can. I think at least I know the percentage of that is probably percentage total respondents. So I can at least kind of figure that out. But because it's not organized, I can't really figure out which practices are being adopted. And again, because of the categories, I'm not sure what those mean. So yeah, the only one I could really tell from this would be that they were satisfied with a particular practice before the conference, and that would probably be modification of N application, modifying nitrogen application, and also pest management, that they're all pretty satisfied with that prior to going to the meeting. But other than that, I can't really tell a whole lot from this, Jean, and it makes it challenging on my part to know what to change or what to improve in that meeting or what people are adopting.
Yeah, and that one column, I'll try that. I'll try this this cropping year. That one is pretty solid, and you could kind of look down and see, oh, okay, well, that's actually not bad. And we've got, the experiment with cover crops, that's 38%, so that's pretty good. And so you can kind of go down that column and see you know, which practices, how they kind of stack up. But again, yeah, it's a lot of work to try to sift through this data. And so we do know that there are, you know, some better ways to go about that. And we figured that out for the next season.
Yeah, so we're going to move beyond my pre-gene years and onto where we started really presenting the data in a way that we can understand it. And this is where Gene really specializes with the not only, let's talk about this figure, the category titles, the way it's presented, what we can pull from this from our cover crop practices adoption from the Cafe Talks evaluation we just did in 2019. So Gene, if you could walk us through this as to what we're looking at here.
Yeah, sure. So I think that I do want to point out first that this is actually a report page. This is not a presentation slide. So if it were an actual presentation slide, it would break about 1,000 rules of nobody can read it. There's too many columns. There's too much data, too much information. But this is how we present, how I present my reports. The data visualization is not just a little, you know, fad that people are going through. If you're going to visualize your data, it's actually going to help you interpret it. And so if your visualization is not giving you additional insight into your data, then yeah, there's no reason to create a graph or whatever. But what we do here is I've created this graph. We've got 4 categories. I am doing this as a result of having attended these cafe talks. That's very specific. I'm considering doing this as a result of having attended the cafe talks. I was already doing this prior to any cafe talks, and I am not considering doing this. Okay, so these are 4 pretty specific categories that are all going to give us some meaningful data. I've organized the data from smallest to largest of adoption. So these are the guys who are doing these things as a result of the cafe talk. So you can see that the bar on the far right is the one that most people have adopted. The other things that you can learn here are in those dark charcoal bars. We've got, you know, and I've put the numbers as yellow there. This is the low hanging fruit. Okay. I'm considering doing this. So you've got almost half your people are thinking about doing this. They're on the fence. So maybe they just need that one little, you know, nudge to get them to the other side of the fence to give that out. So this kind of can tell you that maybe we need to focus on these things at our next meeting. And figure those things out. The other thing, like the 44% that's bright red, that's a pretty big number for I'm not even considering doing this. So is this a practice that's not really important for everybody to adopt? Or is this a practice that is important that we want everybody to adopt, but 44% are not doing it? That means we might need to have another look at how we're presenting this data or who we're getting to the table to figure it out.
Yeah, this has been a really helpful way to look at what we're doing because I've taken those numbers, you know, those yellow numbers on there, the ones where people are considering these practices, and that's where we focus a lot of our content. Then is if we need to just provide a little more information in those areas to get people to take the plunge and adopt those practices, then that's kind of where we're focusing. And this has helped us with a lot of our soil health programming. Also, when I do report these numbers to the funding agencies for these programs, specifically this Cafe Talk program, I'll put in there, I'll add up the, you know, I'm doing this as a result of or considering as a result of. I'll say because of this program, farmers are either doing this as a result of or considering it, and I'll add up those numbers. 61% of those farmers are in those 2 categories, and then you have a lot of impact to show for people attending, and to continue that money coming in. And you know, with the Cafe Talks program, it has been because they're so informal and because of the format of them, and because you know, they do cost a lot of money to do. I've needed those numbers to show the impact of these smaller style meetings that have a greater connection. So this has been incredibly helpful, and everybody can look at this, whether you're a researcher, extension, a farmer, a consultant, a funding agency. You can see those numbers, and they look. You can tell what this program is doing and those practices that are being adopted. So much better way to show it than the table that we showed before.
Yeah, I mean,
so
it
thanks,
does help.
Jane, for that.
You're welcome.
So what's our next one? Practice adoption question. Let's figure out how we ask this in our survey so that people can emulate this in their programs.
Right. So this was how we asked the question. This is the question that got us to that data. And this is what it looks like in Qualtrics. And I'm going to bet that most of you are using Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, but I think almost all universities are on Qualtrics these days. because it's one of the best out there. So what cover crop practices have you or your operation, your part, or the operation that you're part of, started doing as a result of attending the cafe talk? So highlighting the words that are important, because as we know, we've taken all the surveys too. We just breeze right through things and don't always read carefully. And so I make sure that, highlight the things that you really want them to read. Okay, this is about cover crop practices, and I want to know if they've started doing it as a result of attending them. If they don't recall the topic being covered, hit NA. And you see that little red X next to the NA, don't recall the topic at the meeting. That means that that number is not actually going to be included in any of the analysis. So if they didn't attend it, then their data shouldn't be averaged out, or none of it should be in the frequencies. It shouldn't count in there. And then we have the categories at the top, and then that just a straight up list at the bottom. I mean, on the left-hand side. And that's just, all these different categories of the different cover crops that happen during the cafe talks. So that's,
Another
yeah,
thing
we
we
just
did,
want
another thing we did with this question, Jean, was that because we had both farmers and consultants
to.
attending our meetings, we broke this question into two parts. So we had them answer if they were a farmer or a consultant. If they were a farmer, they got asked this question, were they adopting these practices as a result of attending the cafe talks? If they were a consultant, they got shifted to another part of the survey where they were asked, are you recommending these specific practices as a result of attending? And so I think that that's important too, is that we can't ask consultants, other educators, we need to break those categories out when looking at practice adoption, because the way we're talking about them, we're recommending them, we're actually applying them is very different based on your profession. So lumping them together doesn't make sense. You need to separate those as well.
Yes, and that's an excellent point, Abby. And one of the things that, and I think this actually refers back to a question that we had last week about, we have all sorts of specialists who attend our meetings. How do we get the data from them? Well, this is what we do. We break them out into a separate group, and we ask them the question in a more appropriate way. So for consultants, that are you recommending this as a result? And we can show big impacts with that, because we know that in general, one consultant is going to impact far more acreage than one grower, generally speaking, unless the consultant only has one grower.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to encourage anyone that this is kind of, I think, our first part of this on questions in a survey. I think we're going to go into something else a little bit different now, on network analysis. So if you have questions, that we would love for you to put them in the Q&A or in the chat if that's more convenient for you. On this first part on how are we asking the questions, the categories we're using, the way we're breaking this out into a Qualtrics survey to really get the information we need about this program. I should mention too, on this Cafe Talk evaluation, we do have an entirely different category too. If you work for NDSU, you're a researcher or your extension, you get kicked to another set of questions because we want to know how these concepts you're learning or the styles you're learning in this programming are influencing the way you teach in the classroom, or influencing the research grants that you write, or giving you the confidence to host these programs on your own as an extension agent or specialist. So it's a pretty complex survey that's getting at a lot of different angles, but it's also, this is beyond a paper copy that you're giving out at a meeting.
Right.
But our response rates are better. And Jean, what do we expect when we send out these surveys? What kind of response rate are we looking for?
Well, the one thing is that you can get better response rate if you're doing it in person, and you're right there, because you've got that captive audience, and they're not going to leave the room until they've turned in their little piece of paper for you. So that is true. But on these on meetings, boy, I tell you what, Abby, things have changed since last March. There's pre-COVID and post-COVID for everything, it seems like, and especially for these virtual meetings. Our response rates are going to be a lot less than they were beforehand, because we get a lot of people who may register for something and then not show up. And so then we're not going to get that data, but our original registration data shows that we have 600 people, but really only 300 people showed up. So you got to kind of take that into consideration. I think that, you should hope for and shoot for 50 to 60% response rate on these online surveys, especially the longer ones with the growers. If you can, shoot for that 50%, and there are ways to do that, with reminders and motivation and those kinds of things. But yeah, I think for these meetings, we've done pretty well. We've generally gotten somewhere around the, 50 to 65% range of response rates, but that was, pre-COVID. So we'll see what the December numbers look like.
I see, Jean, that there's a question that came up in the chat.
What are your thoughts on asking participants to fill in a before knowledge rating of themselves at the start of an activity or event, then after at the end of the event, and using how much they improved or not? We have found that then we rate that change is generally better showing change versus having people just giving their own rating overall. So that's a good question. And this, I've done this all the different ways, okay? So this is kind of that pre-test, post-test model. You can pre-test somebody's knowledge beforehand and post-test it afterwards. If you've actually got specific things like, a classroom setting is obviously the best, example of this, where we want to know how much they know about, XYZ in soil health. You can test them and find out, how much they know by having these very specific test questions. And then at the end, you can then test them again and see if they've gained that knowledge. And that is definitely a more, I suppose, accurate way of doing it if you're in that kind of a setting. Generally speaking, with growers in field days or cafe talks, we're not going to start a meeting with a test. That's like the worst thing you can do for somebody. Is let's start this with a test. In like, I showed up here because I don't know. That's why I'm here, because I don't know, right? So not a great way to start a meeting. But if you've got, some things built into your slides where you might be quizzing them on identifying different grasses or something like that, and you're using the turning point technology that Marisol shared a couple weeks ago, that might be a good way to get a baseline on what they know. And then at the end, after some presentation time, ask them to, again, identify these different grasses, and then see if that does shift. Looking at one of the things that we could ask people is to rate their knowledge on their own. Again, this is an opinion before the meeting starts, rate your knowledge on XYZ. And then after the meeting, we can ask them to rate their knowledge again. So the thing that happens with this particular format, however, is that sometimes we don't know what we don't know. Sometimes we think we know a lot about something, and it turns out we didn't really know that much. Or it turns out that, oh, wow, I knew a lot more about that than I thought I did after a presentation. So I did this experiment in a big program that I was evaluating many years ago up in Chicago. And I had a whole room full of teachers, and we did this with dots on the wall. We had big piece of flip charts, and they could put their dots up, their rating for each question for beforehand. They all filled out what it was beforehand. And then after the whole conversation and the lesson and the lesson plan, afterwards, they went up and they rated both what they should have done beforehand and what they should have done afterwards. And that number was very different. What they rated themselves beforehand, and then what they rated their before score after the session was very different, because they got to learn how much they didn't know or how much they did already know. So that number is actually a little bit more accurate in terms of trying to figure out if there's been change. But yeah, if you can ask very specific test questions, that would be great. And if it's appropriate, don't start your meeting with a test though.
We did that with one of our meetings where we had several farmers attending too. And when you do that for the farmers, it's fun to take that test alongside them.
Yes.
And so you can both see what you don't know. And I often relate it to farmers as this is like that Rodney Dangerfield movie, Going Back to School, where he goes back to college. And it's just, most people have seen that movie, and it's just kind of funny to think of it that way. And if you make it fun, then it takes a little bit of that testing out of it and more of a just, checking your knowledge to see what you know. So thank you for those great questions in the chat and comments. Let's get into this network analysis, because I think this is really one of the more insightful things that we've done, Jean. And so this is the question that we would ask in Qualtrics. This is what we did ask for the Cafe Talk Evaluation 2019 to get names of growers and to build these network maps. So Jean, what are the most important parts of this question here?
So again, these are, highlighted. And I know that you guys can't read this print. Somebody said that in the chat as well. Again, this wasn't necessarily meant to be, a slide for a presentation. This is a snapshot of what a question looks like in Qualtrics. And the point here is like highlight important things. We value your privacy. Your answers will be used anonymously. People care about this. You're asking them to name names. And we need to tell them names will not be publicly released. And they need to trust you and know that that's true. We wanted them to list up to 4 people, but we wanted them to list at least one person, and that was highlighted because the last time we did this, the previous one, we didn't get a lot of people respond to this. And I think it's, that trust wasn't quite there yet, that we were going to use this data appropriately, and not give away, all the secrets about who said what about whom. And that kind of wasn't there yet. And so we also want to know how often they communicated with somebody. So this is that network analysis. We covered this last week on some of our, what do we do and how are we measuring how people are how information is getting out there. So this is that first question. Which are the 4 growers that you speak to the most frequently about soil health? And so they name their names and then they say how often they actually spoke with them. And that's the rating. So along the left side, it's just a grower name that they fill in, and across the top, it's daily, weekly, monthly, or less than monthly. Pardon me. So this is kind of how you structure that question. There are very specific ways that you can ask things, but make it very clear that you are not going to be using their names in any data reporting, and you are going to do everything you can to keep everything that they've told you anonymous. These network maps are usually pretty harmless, but I could see possibly in some settings them getting abused. But in this particular arena, I don't see that really happening.
And I want to mention too that this question that we asked for the network analysis, this went through multiple pilot tests. To really get this question right, we asked farmers, consultants, I suppose mainly farmers for this one, because that's who we're having answer the question. But we asked them, does this make sense? And then we had them fill it out a couple different times just to see what was confusing. And then Jean would actually call them and talk with them about it and talk through how they answered that question. So so this one it was really important to do the pilot testing on it, which we've mentioned in the past too, to make sure that people understand what you're asking and where you're going with that question.
Yeah, Abby, that's an excellent point. And I think we've kind of mentioned it and glossed over it in the past, but the pilot test is, I think, one of the most important things that you can do for any survey that you're going to do. And I pilot test every one of my instruments unless I know that these are all questions that are tried and true in this exact same demographic, because extension speak is not the same as grower speak. And apple growers in Michigan speak very differently than apple growers in North Carolina. Okay, so you've got people in different states, they're doing the same thing, but maybe their lingo is a little bit different and they understand things differently. And so I pilot test every one of these, whether it's a paper survey or an online survey. In a paper survey, I have them sit down and they take it so that I time it and I know exactly how long it takes so that I can tell them how long it takes and not lie to them. And that's always something that's up front. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we do our intro. What do you want to include in your introductory slide for a question for an online survey? But I do want to really impress upon you the importance of pilot testing. I send out the survey and I have them fill it out just like they would if they'd gotten it from me, out of nowhere. Pardon me. And then I spend time with them, 15 minutes on the phone with them, and we go through every single question, and I make sure that question means what I think it means. Because if it doesn't, then, and it means something different to the grower or whoever my audience is, then we actually sit right there and wordsmith it and figure out how to ask it in a way that means what we want it to mean to them. And that, every single survey I've ever done, I've had at least 1 or 2 tweaks on brand new questions if they're questions that haven't been asked before. And so, yeah, this one was pilot tested, and this has been used a few different times. And then every year, we might make a new tweak. We might, we added on this one, we added that please list at least one person, like a last little plea, please make one, at least one. And that did help with our response rates on this.
So now, Jean, there's a question in the Q&A about, do we change the format of this question for the network analysis if we're targeting farmers versus consultants or agronomists? And how might this question change in those 2 different scenarios? And we haven't we haven't done that because we've only asked farmers for these networks. But Jean, what do you think how that would change? Maybe the pilot testing would change who you ask to answer those questions or to
Absolutely. And
review
so,
it.
yeah, absolutely. And so if you're pilot testing an instrument, then and you've got a couple of different audiences, then you want to make sure that you've got all those audiences represented in your pilot test. If you're going to ask this question, if you want to know who they're talking to, then you want to think about, again, what is it that you're trying to figure out and why you're trying to figure it out. So if you're asking your consultants slash agronomists, what do you want to know from them? Do you want to know who they're talking to about? I mean, I guess I'm not sure why you would want to do that with those guys. I guess you would. The non-growers would make more sense to me. So if you've got your consultants, I'd want to know how their information is flowing through to them because we know that they're the conduit to the grower, right? If I understand correctly.
Yeah, it sounds like we'd have to think about this for a while to come
Yeah,
up with a
this is
good
kind of how
answer
we go
for
through
how
all
this
our,
would work.
when we make all of our questions, right, Abby?
Right,
We kind of
right.
try to figure out what is it that we really want to know. And so
So
maybe
I
we
think in
want
short,
to
we could
know.
say yes, that this may differ based on who you're asking, right? I mean, you would really try to make sure that that question is relatable, understandable, and something that those individuals could answer
Hmm.
based on the way you ask it and what you're asking them for names of. Is it
Hmm.
names of their
Exactly.
growers, names of other growers, names of people with extension that they're talking to? I think you could cross a lot of different boundaries there too. So
Yeah.
but
And
let's see how
go
we
ahead.
use this data though, Jean, because I think
Hmm.
this is where I get super excited about what we're doing. So let's take a
Yeah.
look at an example of a network map. And so I'll just kind of, get everybody lined up on this. And Jean, please add in where I'm missing something. So this is the network map. You saw the question that the farmers were asked. They had to list names of 4 growers or at least one other farmer that they're talking to on, different timings, right? So weekly, monthly, that kind of thing. So if we look at this, 51 people responded to that part of the survey that we sent out. And we had 134 people that were listed. So those were 134 names that were listed, right, Jean?
Right. Oh,
Okay.
yes. Yeah. Hmm.
And then of those 134, 111 of them were actually connected by some kind of line, right?
Right.
Uh, if we look at the largest connected group where multiple people in this network are connected, the largest connected one where they're all connected is 20. So 20 individuals are somehow getting information through each other in this format. And Jean, you can totally correct me if I got that wrong, but but
Yeah, and that's
what
the
we're
general idea. The idea is that this is something that we always look at in network analysis is we call it the connected. What's the largest connected component? It's called a component if you've got a whole group of people that are connected. So we have a whole bunch of disparate dots in that map there, but we've got 20 whatever it is 20 guys. Yeah, 20 guys who are connected to each other in some way. And that's that. It looks like it's in that bottom sort of leftish side. You can see that great big sort of blob of people that are all connected to each other. And so and the guys over on the right, they named some guy and the other guys named some other guy. And you can see that those guys are not necessarily connected to a network, but they're connected to each other. So there are a couple of points. But that one with the 20, they're all connected to each other somehow.
And so, Jean, we're getting a question in the Q&A on how do we adjust the responses when people may not know or list the actual names, or perhaps they list only an organization. If we're able to lump that data, my initial response to that is that if you're not able to list the name, even the first name, or poorly, you can't spell it, or something like that, then maybe that's not truly part of the network because there isn't that personal connection. But I don't know, Jean, what is your feeling on that as to, if a farmer were to list NDSU extension as somebody in the network, would that work, or how would you address that?
So if it's farmer to farmer, if we're asking them for specifically farmer to farmer, then if they don't know the guy's name, they weren't talking to him enough for it to matter to us, right? You're going to know that name of that guy that you talked to who is another farmer. When we followed up that question with, okay, who are the 4 non-growers who you speak with um, uh, the most about soil health? And then we did ask them to name the person and their affiliation or their organization. And in that case, sometimes we did get the whole, NDSU extension because they didn't want to name one single person. In that case, we might have a dot for a category. But again, it doesn't work very well. And these are all going to be very, case by case basis, right? If you get 15 people who say NDSU extension, then maybe NDSU extension becomes its own dot. And then you can see that somebody in extension is going through, these people are talking to somebody. But I do think that if you're asking for specific names, they should come up with a name. The whole spelling thing, that brings up another point, Abby. Social network analysis is not for the faint of heart. Cleaning data is going to take you time because you're going to get the person who writes Bill Johnson, the next one's going to write William Johnson, the other guy's going to write Billy Johnson. You're going to have to clean all that data up. And that is time consuming. And then you have to also make sure that, sometimes there's a Bill Johnson Jr. and a Bill Johnson Sr. And they just say Bill Johnson, we need to kind of figure out and make that call, right? So data cleaning, becomes important. And so the other thing then too is just be careful with these maps and what you're trying to do with them and what you're trying to say about them. We're trying to get some general idea of what the network looks like and how information is flowing through it and how big our connected components are, so that we can see whether or not we're developing. This was one of the questions that Abby had about her cafe talks was, I'm trying to build a network, these communities, a network of people who can actually, help each other out, share information, share equipment. This is what you were trying to build. And so this is what we're trying to measure. We're not trying to get any, more specific than that. Did that help answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Let's take a look at, so we saw that first version of the map where farmers are listing farmers and we had the largest connected group of 20.
Right.
Let's take a look at what that looks like when we add in the other groups. When we ask those farmers to list 4 names of other people who are non-growers to be part of this network. And this is something that my who of needs this information, my bosses love this, right? Because this shows a lot of value to extension, to NDSU as being part of this network. So in this network, again, the same 51 respondents. Now we have 240 individuals in the network with 232 connections. But the big number you need to look at here is the largest connected group is now not 20, it's 116. And so clearly the consultants, the financial, the government, the industry, NDSU are all helping these farmers connect in some way that, when we think of soil health, we think of a farmer-led and farmers connecting and farmers helping farmers. But there's a really important piece here that's a lot of other people that aren't farmers are helping this information be shared. So this is one that shows a lot of impact, and this is a great way to show that impact in doing this network analysis.
Yes, Abby, and that's a great point. It's this is something that we can see. If we take all these other people out of the equation and we just looking at the growers, then information flow is going to be restricted to that group of 20 if we're talking about flow. And then we got to get that information to all those other guys that are just connected to 1 or 2. Whereas here, we can see that information is going to be flowing. And the question was, who do you talk to about soil health, right? And so what was surprising to me was that, some financial guys came up. Some guys are actually talking to their bankers about what they're doing, and I'm assuming it has to do with, the loans that they're getting. And so they are actually talking to their financial guys. And the government, I'm going to guess that these are probably some ARS folks or NRCS folks. And so these are all these people are part of this network. And the other thing that I think that this tells me is that you want to make sure that you get all of these industries, all these different sectors represented at your meetings if you want the same information flowing through the information network. So the more you can get all these guys represented at your bigger meetings. If you have smaller meetings, obviously you can have more targeted things, but know that you need to reach, each of these different sectors.
Well, and I think too, Jean, this has showed me, when we started the cafe talks, we wanted it to be 99% growers, right? We wanted maybe one person from NDSU, one person from NRCS,
Mm-hmm.
there to help with the conversation. But then this, in seeing this, it helps me reevaluate that initial
Mm-hmm.
intention of that program to, okay, well, we need to make sure that we have other consultants involved there. We need, we need to really expand this program so that it suits multiple needs.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, we still do want it to be predominantly farmers, but at the same
Right.
token, they're benefiting from having all these other individuals at that meeting as well, that it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to be just farmers to share information. So, so this has helped me reevaluate the program we're doing and how our approach to it. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Jean, there's a question about how do you actually create the map? And I am sure that this is a lengthy answer. To go from that question to this visual representation, maybe it's just a program that you use that you could mention.
Yes, so there, yeah, so I'm not going to go into all of the details, but the program that I am using is called Node Excel, NODEX, letters XL, and it's an Excel, like Excel spreadsheet. It's Excel add-in, and it's probably the easiest. It's the shortest learning curve because we're all familiar with the Excel environment. And it's an Excel add-in, and when you buy it and you download it, you just get another tab that's all about Node Excel. Um, Basically, and then no matter, and then there's other Gephi, GEPHI is a free piece of software that you can download, and it's a little bit more difficult to use, but it's very powerful in other ways. And then there's other software that's out there, but no matter which one you do, you enter person one, person two, my fingers aren't showing up, person one, person two, and then person three, person two, person one, person two. So you connect all the people. So I would say Bobby and Joe named Susie, Susie named Joe, Bobby named Sue. And so all of those are going to be in that column, and that's going to tell you what all your connections are and what your dots are. And then it spits out what's called a node, a vector, a vertex sheet as well. But yeah, so that went right into the weeds, didn't it? Basically, you have to say who talked to whom, and then you put that into your little program. No matter what you're using, you're not going to use this with off-the-shelf stuff. If you're not going to use this with something unless you're using R. You can do this in R if you're a good R programmer. There's a bunch of folks out there who have written network analysis code that you can go, pilfer from, and they might do it differently. But you basically have to say who talked to whom, and plug those into your data, and then it will crank out this map for you. And then you have to do a little bit of work with how you present the map and coloring the
And
dots.
you have to make sure that that data is clean, like you said, that you've gone through, you've looked at the names, figured out the spellings and things like that, so that it can be connected in that program. Now, there's another really good question on, how can we create new connections for those people who are less connected in the network, and what is your thought process for connecting with new people? Now, with these maps, I mean, we tell them that their names are anonymous, correct? I mean, that we're not going to share their names.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you look at this map as an individual consultant doing the programming, right? I can identify individuals in there who are nodes or contacts that I can make sure have the best information. They're cooperators on projects. They're some of these I can just figure out probably on my own, but I think not everybody's going to see the data, but the person doing the programming can identify who needs the most information because they're the most connected. And so that's one way to do it. And then some of those other that are kind of on the fringe or connected, maybe you could look for, are they attending the program, or, I mean, and this is one person looking at this information. Are they attending programs? Can you cross check it with your registration sheets? When they're at another program, can you form another connection with them? So it's a lot of legwork and interpretation on one person's part, because not everybody gets to see the information, but that's, I think, how you use it. And Jean, I don't know if there's other advice you have on using that to create more connectivity in this map, or.
Yes, and I think that you bring up one of the things that I kind of went through my head quickly was that, yeah, you can look at each of these individual dots and then cross-reference them. But again, you want to look at how important is it for me to connect with that one person? Are they an important person? If you've identified that they're, the largest grower, and so we want to get them involved, then you want to spend some time to figure out how to make that connection. But if they're not necessarily one of the largest growers, you just want to make sure that you're reaching out as best you can to all the folks. I think that in these, for us, these data are really helping us see, what the network looks like and how it's evolving over time. And we've got a time series that kind of comes up next that you'll be able to see. But this is something that, we just want to be able to see, are we building this? Are we successfully building a network of people who are going to be able to share information, equipment, and help each other and increase soil health in our region? We're not necessarily, trying to figure out what groups are being left out. There are other ways to collect that data, I think, and I think you could even do that with your basic surveys from your meetings. If you collect demographic data, you collect their zip codes, and you collect what their profession is, or you collect what crops they're growing. If you want to make sure that you're reaching enough guys who are doing pulses, then you want to see, oh, we only have like 2 or 3, then maybe we want to figure out new ways to reach out to the pulse community. And so I think there's other ways that could be more appropriate to figure out how to targeting specific audiences. So we were using this data for a very different reason. And so, we want to try to stay within that, that world that we've asked the question for a specific reason.
Great. Well, let's look at some of those other maps, Jean. We've got some more questions coming up, and we have 5 minutes left tonight, so we are going to run over. So everybody that's listening, I apologize that we are going to run over, but this has been great conversation, great questions, and I want to make sure that we address your questions as we go through this. So here's an example. This is what you can do with registration information. And this is where Jean and I started before doing the listing the names and those kinds of things was, who's attending the Cafe Talks from the registration list. These are the names we got. These are the professions that they listed. So making sure that we're asking these questions on our registration sheet can be really helpful for creating at least some kind of diagram to show what's happening. So this is in 2014 when the network first started. We had a couple locations there in the royal blue. There were 3 locations where we had meetings. And so you can see again that, the professions on here, blue is farmers, red are consultants, green is NDSU, yellow is, I believe, government agency. And if we go through, this is how it changed in 2015 when we added a couple more locations to the Cafe Talk program. So we've got how many in there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 locations that we were reaching now, if I'm adding that
7,
up correctly.
yeah.
But you can see the royal blue are the locations, and then you're seeing how these individuals now are forming this network. 2016, we had a few more locations, a few more people. 2017, you can see that continuing to add as we add more locations. And then by 2018, this is what our network map looked like for those people who are attending our meetings. Now, the thing that when I look at this that I think is really interesting for Cafe Talks is that if they were just attending one meeting, say in Lemoore or, Thompson, then they would stay in that little category over there, right, Jean? They would just kind of be connected to that dot and that's it.
Right. Yeah, those are
But
the
we
whiskers,
see a lot of
kind of the
crossover.
whiskers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of people move from those exterior locations on the outside of this spider's web, and they're moving to the inside because they're attending multiple locations. They're, interacting with different people who are now moving inside the network and getting information that way. So it's number one, it shows that it takes time to create these networks and to build these relationships, but then also that when you look at this network, now you know that one person could leave that network and it will still persist. It gives more reliance on the community versus individuals within that community. So, so that's kind of what I like to see about this. And this is something you just get from your registration data.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to point out on this is that, the green is the NDSU and the blue are the growers and the red are the consultants. And so what I think is really cool about this map, that it's not just the green guys in the middle who are running the meetings, who are connected to all the different meetings and different people. You've got a bunch of growers and you've got, some key consultants there who are, also attending more than one and, interacting with more than one group of people. And I think that that's important for your network as well.
Yeah, now there's some other information too. This is a really cool thing you can do from registration information, but you can also do these amazing zip code maps, which I think anyone that follows me on Twitter knows I love posting these because at registration, we ask you for your zip code. And so this is an example of who was there at the communication workshop back on December 7th. This is the audience we reached. Now this map isn't complete. Actually, what I did with this map that when I had maybe a week before the actual workshop is I looked at where the gaps were. in that. And so I actually contacted someone with extension down at Louisiana State and
Mhm.
said, "Hey, we've got this great workshop coming up. Would you mind, sending it out to your, people that work at Louisiana State?" And I had contacted some people up in New Hampshire, and I found the gaps where maybe we weren't quite hitting, the entire United States. And me, because I'm a little bit competitive and I like to, make sure that I'm covering the entire United States and Canada. It was fun to look at this and use it as a tool to say, okay, I'm going to contact some people that I know or not know in other areas and get this information on this workshop to them. But this can show a lot of impact, especially, when we're looking at just North Dakota. For the North Dakota funding agencies I work with, I will show them a map specific of where farmers are listening to things or they're attending from North Dakota specifically, because that's what they care about. So you can take these maps and kind of and show them in whatever scope you want to, but they can be really effective. And it's a simple question on a registration format.
And Abby,
Um,
somebody asked what software you use. You do this with an online thing, right?
yeah, I can't remember which one it is, but if you just type in Google zip code map, you'll get several different forms. I think this is Google Maps
Uh-huh.
because it has the most flexibility. But yeah, it
And
doesn't take long to create. You just take that list from your registration, you pop it into that mapping program, and then it creates this for you, usually for free, up
yeah.
to a certain number of zip codes that you enter. So
Mhm.
this can be a really great way to show some impact and do it relatively inexpensive. And I see a question here in the Q&A about how much time do you recommend devoting for evaluation of your activities? And these analyses take a lot of time, and how do you decide if it's worth it? Something like this is quick, inexpensive, and it can be done fairly easily. The network work maps from the registrations can be done. I think, Jean, you probably spend more time than I give you credit, but because you move the dots around to make sure it's visually appealing,
Mhm.
um, and shows what's happening. But for me, I gain so much out of this evaluation, and the way that we direct our programming, that spending time on this to spend the tens of thousands of dollars I spend on programming is worth it.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that, I also want to kind of bring it back to, the way you know that is because you've done your needs assessment, right? So
right.
it's always, for me, it's always going to come back to that. What do you need to evaluate? Why do you need to evaluate it? Who's it serving? How much time and money do I have? So if you don't have time and money to do like a social network analysis, like I've done using Node Excel, you certainly have time and money to crank out a zip code map on, on a free Google form, right? So what level of data do you need to collect? And if you do need something more in depth that helps you understand what your network looks like and helps you map, what's been happening over time, then you might want to make sure you find the time and the resources to do that. So it's always going to come back to that network, that needs assessment. Do I really need to do a network analysis? It's really cool. It's super cool. Everybody loves it. The maps are awesome. They're fun to look at, but is it serving your needs? Is it what you need for your particular program? Maybe you just need to know what the reach is, and you can create a cool zip code map on, online. Excel will let you do a zip code map as well. Um, and it actually will do it more GIS formatty. And it's not too hard to learn. It's pretty easy if you were in Excel and you just, typed in the help. How do I make a map? And it'll tell you. They
Well,
all
and
tell
I
you
can
that
tell you
now.
too that with the evaluation information that we're collecting, not only do I show it to farmers at meetings, because I want them to understand why they're filling out all these surveys and helping us collect this information, because I want to show them how it's influencing the programming that we're delivering. But I can't tell you how many times I've taken this to funding agencies, and in a time where funding is being cut and it's harder and harder to get that money, that I've been able to get the full amounts of money because I've taken this evaluation information and shown them the impact our program is having. So it could be a difference of $40,000 on one grant, another 20,000 on another, but it can be if you show the impact you're having, especially in the outreach, and that it's getting to the people that they want to have that information, and how it's changing their practices or not changing their practices, that's a big deal, and that shouldn't be. Yeah, it takes a lot of time, but I think it's, for me, it's been worth it, and I think everybody else kind of figures that out based on their needs assessment, like Jean said.
Mhm.
We do have a couple more things to go through because Jean and I love showing information. Here's another free thing you can do. Twitter network map. And this is just creating a hashtag for a meeting, like for the Dirt Workshop ND, Com Workshop ND, Soil Talk Tuesdays. We create hashtags for our meetings. And then Jean is able to create these maps from our Twitter following and exchange of information. We did it last week with Com Workshop ND and the map wasn't super impressive. So we thought we'd show you what it's like for a multi-day meeting where a lot of people are involved. And this is something that you can pull together, again, using Note Excel, right, Jean?
Yes, that's Note Excel. So this one is actually really easy to do. It's really a point and click. They have a menu item and you just say, download from Twitter, and then you type in hashtag Dirt Workshop ND, and it'll chug for a while depending on how big your map is. If your map is really big, it's going to chug for a long, long time. But if it's smallish, like this is considered smallish because some people work with tens of thousands of nodes, then you can, it'll chug for a little while, it'll spit it out, and then you have to just hit the graph it button. And I move things around a little bit so that they're not necessarily overlapping each other, so that we can see things more clearly. And but yeah, and then there's ways to make it so that they show your picture, and those are other little fancy parts. But yeah, it's a point and click. If you have Note Excel, it's point and click, and it's really simple to do.
Yeah, so just another way to graphically show your impact. Boy, Jean, we still have a lot of information to get through. But we'll just keep chugging along. If everybody's okay and you're hanging in there and you want this information, I think we'll just keep going, right, Jean? Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so observations. This is another evaluation tool that I think goes unnoticed sometimes because maybe we don't formalize it. So this is what we've been doing for the cafe talks. For each of those individual meetings that are discussion based, we have another individual that is either a technician that works for me, or sometimes, I want the county agents to be engaged in that meeting and not doing the evaluation. So I try to bring in somebody else that can do this for us. But this is, going through for a specific, topic number one or whatever that may be, whether it's cover crops, and checking off the topics that are covered within that specific topic. Experts engaged, you can see on the bottom, we have, just tick marks, very simple for, to NDSU, probably people have been engaged, or NRCS, or somebody that's with an organization that is engaged in this. And the number of participants in that conversation. So that may be the farmers that are attending. How many of them are asking questions and engaged or providing information in this context or at this meeting? And then, the observations part of, are people getting bored? Are they checking their phones? So here's a great observation that they turned up the heater before the meeting to shut it off when they started, so it didn't make too much noise. That's something that we can know about that location. Is that the best fit then for this meeting? Or does the fact that people can't hear affect the transfer of information? So a lot can be gained on this. This is not meant to be your notes from college or high school where you're writing everything down that's said. This is meant to be an observation of what topics are covered, what's the environment like, who all is engaged. Jean, anything to add to this one on the observation part?
Yeah, just one point that this was a piece of paper on a clipboard. That big black bar was just we cut that table down so we could fit it on the slide. But yeah, it's a piece of paper on a clipboard, and even though it might not look like very many people were engaged because there were just like two, but that was 2 experts and 3 people who were addressing a very specific topic. There are usually in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 of these sheets per cafe talk. So each time a new topic happens, new topic of conversation kind of comes up, whoever's taking notes takes that one piece off the top and then starts a new one and go, oh, here, now we're talking about weeds. And they're going to start checking weeds. And then they're going to have, again, the little tick marks on how many people are participating. And so this has helped us, if we jump right up to that next slide, Abby, this kind of shows exactly how we took that data, that specific data that we had, and helped understand the practice adoption data. So on the left, we know you guys can't read the type on this. That wasn't the point. We just trying to show a picture here. On the left, these are the practices that people said they were adopting. So again, it's those green bars at the bottom are what they're adopting as a result. And then over on the right, this was just a quick and dirty, you can make those little bar graphs right in your Excel sheet. And it shows you what topics were covered at every single meeting. And so Abby, why don't you tell me what this, tell us share with us the sort of the important thing that put two and two together for you on this piece of data.
Yeah, when I looked at this figure, when Jean presented it to me in the report, I saw that we were talking a lot about cover crops and tillage, right? I mean, 90 or 100% of the time we were covering something on salt-affected areas of cover crops in general, and tillage. And then when I looked at the practices that were being adopted on the left-hand side in the yellow there, or being considered, they were all related to cover crops.
Mhm.
And so that was interesting to me because we've been talking about tillage 100% of the time. We've also been talking about cover crops 100% of the time. The salt affected part kind of showed up there on the right hand bar graph, that people were adopting cover crops for salt affected part of the fields, but I didn't see anything about adoption of tillage practices. So that was like, okay, we're talking about it, but it's not being adopted. Well, why would that be? And so if we look at the next piece of information that we went to after that, were barriers of adoption. And this is a great question to ask on a survey. In 2016, we weren't sure what those barriers might be. So we kind of, we had some idea. So we had a few categories there. But if you look at the top barriers for both 2016 and 2019 in this evaluation, or this survey that we did, it's that the cost of appropriate equipment, right? I mean, it's equipment, lack of appropriate equipment. So if we're talking about, reduced till practices, you need probably different disc openers to do that. You may need a strip till machine, which is a huge investment. You may need a different tractor to pull that equipment. There are a lot of equipment things in there to reduce tillage that may have influenced those practices being adopted. And so this was a good thing for me to see, because I wasn't thinking about it in this context. And I think, Jean, is that kind of what you saw as well with pulling that information together?
Yeah, it's like, you've asked a question about adoption of practices, but then you want to follow that up with, okay, well, why aren't they? What can we identify some of the things that we might need to address in the future, at future meetings or future research projects? What do we need to address to help them adopt the practices? And in this case, you can't necessarily do anything about the cost of equipment and the lack of equipment, except maybe pair up some guys and say, hey, but so and so down the street has that. Maybe you can borrow it. But other than that, you want to kind of dig deeper and figure out, okay, well, what are some of the things that we can address? And again, we know you can't read those slides, but the other part of that particular slide too is that, between the first survey that we did in 2016 and the second survey that we did in 2019, there were a few more things that became apparent that were barriers to adoption. And so we added that to the list. And you can always add things to your list, but make sure you ask the question in the same way and that you have the other ones that matter, so you can kind of do that comparison, the next time. And so that's what that yellow bar was doing, in there, was like, this was a new question. We asked this because we didn't ask this last time, and it came up somewhere. So yeah, I think that those are really the things that you're going to want to, if you're asking about practice adoption, then it's always going to be really good to then follow that up with what are the barriers, because that's going to help us understand. The next thing you can do, and barriers are something you can also get in focus group data. It's a great question for focus groups, because that synergy happens and the growers start talking about this and that and the other thing, and then problems that they hadn't necessarily thought of before come up because so-and-so mentioned this or that, and you learn a ton sitting in a focus group with guys that's a lot more in depth about what those barriers are. And then the other question that we didn't ask in the survey, but if you're doing this in a focus group, you can follow that up with, well, what are the advantages? In your opinion, we know what we think the advantages are. We've got our expert opinions about all this stuff, but what do the growers see as advantages to adopting a specific practice or some sort of technology that's coming down the road that we're trying to develop? What do they see would benefit them and their community? Because then you get their language and their understanding of what this could be. And then you can also use that in how you present your information.
Great. And again, too, let's look at how we presented this information on this slide. It's very easy to understand. So thank you again, Jean, for that. You can pick out the major and the minor barriers pretty easily on this
Yeah.
graphic, the way it's presented.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the next one we had then was, okay, if equipment is a barrier, not having it, or the cost of equipment, how often are farmers that are attending our meeting sharing equipment? And this was a question that we asked in the survey. And I think I think this is a good one because, our hope is that, neighboring farmers, if one has a planter that can plant into low, high residue systems, that maybe they would plant those acres for that other farmer, or compost spreaders, or we really didn't know what kind of equipment was going to be shared. So we actually asked open-ended question, right, Jean? We just let them fill in equipment that they're sharing and how often.
Right. I mean,
And
we
if
did
you,
actually ask them the question of how often, and that was a very specific question. How often are you sharing equipment? And it was that scale, never less than monthly, monthly, daily, and weekly. That was the scale. Well, it actually went in order on the question. But then this was, oh no, that's actually in the right order. No, it's not. Daily and weekly in the wrong order. But anyway, um, we did ask it in the right order, and we asked them, how often are you sharing equipment? But then we said, if they did say that they were sharing equipment, the next question was a big empty box. What kind of equipment are you sharing? Because we didn't know. And so that's what we captured there. But the first question was definitely close-ended. How often are you sharing equipment?
Great. Thanks for the reminder, because this was 2016. So that was kind of the first iteration of it. We saw that they were sharing equipment monthly.
Mhm.
That went up from before attending the meetings to after. So maybe they'd made some connections there that helped them share equipment, or maybe it opened up the idea of sharing equipment. And then the idea of never sharing equipment did decline from before and
Mhm.
after. So I thought that was kind of interesting that this is again part of that network possibly that's being created.
Mhm.
But we did get, once we had a little more information and we kind of understood what we were asking, then we could ask some of the specifics about pieces of equipment that they were sharing, but then still providing that opportunity for them to list other equipment
Mhm.
that we may not have thought of yet, or we didn't see in the first evaluation that we sent out. And so this is how that question evolved in 2019 when we sent out this survey again.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And so even though you guys can't read it, I can read it for you. It's the vertical tillage unit, no-till unit, strip-till machine, planter, interseeder, harrow, composter. These are the exact things that we saw on the previous side that people actually filled in that open-ended question with. We used what they said they were sharing the next time, because sometimes you don't remember, what you did or didn't do. But if somebody asks you specifically, did you share your harrow with somebody? And you could go, oh yeah, I did actually. And so it makes it easier, your close-ended questions. But then, yeah, again, at the bottom, there are spaces you can, even if you can't read the words, between those, the spaces that are between the big spaces between those last four are for them to write in other equipment that they may have shared.
Awesome. So that's the sharing equipment. We're almost finished up here.
Mhm.
Let's get into that lead off paragraph, Jean, because this is incredibly important
Yeah.
to set the stage for that survey that you send out. And so what are some of the key things that you include in this lead off paragraph to tell people what they're getting into?
Yeah, because this, and this serves two things. Somebody asked it the last time too, is how do you get people motivated to actually fill out the survey, to feel like they need to do it? Well, we've sent them an email, all right? So the first thing is they clicked on that link. Thanks for clicking on the link. So we already told them, but we're going to remind them here that the first thing is, this is what your data is going to help us do. It's going to provide us with feedback to help us improve our workshop, and also to guide future activities. And then we've got, exactly how long it takes them to take the survey. Okay. Don't lie to them. That's why we do that pilot test. I try to figure out exactly how long it takes people to do these surveys. When somebody asks me to do a survey and they say it's going to take me 2 minutes and I'm 5 minutes in and I can see I'm only halfway, I bail, because I just think, oh, you just lied to me. I'm so done with you. I'm out of here. That's not true. So I want to know how much time I need to set aside. If I'd known I had to set aside 10 to 12 minutes, I would have made the time to do it. So tell them exactly how long it's going to take. Let them know their data is confidential if that's the case, and it should be if you made it through IRB. And let them know that all their links of names and data are going to be destroyed. You'll have to, this is IRB stuff, include all your IRB stuff. Your participation is voluntary. There's, nothing, there'll be no penalties if you don't do it. And also give them a contact information for who they can contact about the survey. The one additional thing you can put in there is a contact for whoever's running the program. You can put that right up front too. Some IRBs actually require you to put the IRB number and the IRB office contact information. You need to include that if that's the case. For us, we just decided if they have questions about this survey, they need to ask me about it. In the email invitation, we included Abbey's information and Abbey's contact if they had questions about, cafe talks, or if they had questions about the survey because they just didn't know who the heck this person was, that they'd never seen before, and go, is this, legit? They already know who they could contact through that initial email. And
And
then
the
this
one thing I
bottom
like
thing
about
is
this
I
too,
consent
Jean, is
or I decline. Oh, sorry, Abby, what was that?
I like about this, Jean, is that it's very concise and very short, because we know people don't like to read a lot. So again, highlighting the things that are important, keeping it very, very short. And then, like you're saying, that the consent, I did not attend or I decline options
Yeah.
at the bottom.
Yeah, and that helps with IRB.
Perfect. And last, we're going to end with this, and I really appreciate everybody hanging with us for an extra 20 minutes. Is it just some basic survey tips? Start with the easiest questions first. Don't discourage people by asking very difficult questions first. Don't discourage them by asking their demographics at the beginning. Ask those at the end, because what you really want is that information, those questions that you're asking first and foremost. If they fill in the demographics, that's great, but you got to build that trust with them throughout the survey before you even ask them for those demographics, the acres they farm, all that kind of stuff. You need to, don't ask that right off the bat, because I would never walk up to a farmer and say, how many acres do you farm?
Right?
I would start off asking about their practices. I'd ask about what they're doing. How are they doing it? And that's what you're warming them up with the survey, because at the end, maybe you'd find out, how many acres they're doing that on, or applying that to, but you would never start off a conversation with those demographics on their age or the acres they farm. I'd never ask that right off the bat to a farmer. So keep that in mind with the surveys. And when you're asking for age and acres, don't ask for a range, just ask for the actual number. And Jean, that's so we can do stats on it, right?
Yeah, I can't do math on categories, right? So I can't come up with median scores or median age or median numbers of acres, or even the total number of acres. How are you going to come up with the total number of acres that you are potentially impacting with your programming if you have categories of, 1 to 7 acres, 10 to 25? I can't do math on that. I can't add those up. But if you actually ask them the actual number, people are very hesitant to ask that question. I'm not quite sure why I get that resistance from a lot of extension folks at the beginning. But if we get, 3 or 4, maybe even, whatever, a couple of people who don't want to answer that question, they probably weren't going to answer it anyway. If they don't want to fill in their age and they want to fill in a category, they probably weren't going to fill in the category one either. So just ask them that number so you can do some math. What is the total acreage? What's the median? What's the median age? What's the age range? The age range was, 27 to 82. I can actually tell that range, the exact range, rather than, more than, over 65. How many of those guys were that? So yeah, so that we can do math. Yeah.
And then the
that
biggest
final
thing I've
point,
learned is pilot test your instrument, Jean. That has been I didn't want to bother people with pilot testing. I didn't want to ask growers that I work with to do more than I already am. But in asking them to pilot test it, I think it actually built more trust, and it made them part of the process as well. So if they don't want to pilot test it, give them the option to say, no, I don't want to pilot test it, but always pilot test your instrument, because that's how we've created excellent tools that actually tell us something and show value to our program. So Jean, I can't tell you how career altering it's been for me to have met you at that one workshop when you came to NDSU, but it's changed the entire way that we do programming. Jean says that I would have figured these things out on my own, but I think it would have taken a lot longer. It would have been harder to get funding. It would have been more treacherous. I don't think I would have been able to show the impact that we have with our soil health program here. So Jean, thank you for sharing your experience. And I hope the people that attended today got a lot of information from this and places to start and how they can do their approaches. So is there anything else that you want to end this program with today, Jean?
I'm hoping really that with this, that we're helping share tools with people who can't necessarily afford to hire an outside consultant. Abby's, added money into most of her grants now to include evaluation. But the one super duper take home from me is do your needs assessment. Every time you think, should I do this or should I do that? Go back to, what do I need to know? Why do I need to know it? Who needs to know it? What time and money do I have to actually do it? So that's my big, do your needs assessment, understand exactly what and why you need things.